A glimpse of the past. Deputy Sheriff Clint Walker guided his patrol car along Highway 26, the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt blending with the soft country music playing faintly through the speakers. The early spring morning carried a chill, with mist hanging low over the open fields on either side of the road. Clint sipped from his stainless steel travel mug, the warmth of the coffee a small comfort in the quiet stillness of the dawn. Taped to the dashboard was a photo of Natalie, his daughter, her auburn hair catching the light in her wide, toothy grin. She had insisted on taking that picture the morning she got her braces off, laughing about how her smile would finally look cool. Clint's gaze lingered on the picture for a moment before he forced himself to focus on the road ahead. "Morning, sweetheart," he whispered as he did every day. 5 years had passed since the accident, yet the pain remained, lurking beneath every seemingly normal moment. Natalie's absence was a void he had never learned to fill. As he crested a hill, a flash of movement drew his attention. A rusty blue sedan barreled down the highway, swerving dangerously between lanes. Clint's gut tightened as the sedan narrowly missed an oncoming truck, the blare of the truck's horn echoing over the fields. Adrenaline surged as Clint flipped on his lights and siren. The sedan didn't stop immediately, but eventually pulled onto the shoulder, kicking up gravel. Clint parked behind it, running through the procedure in his head as he approached cautiously. "License and registration, please," Clint said, his tone calm but firm. The driver was a teenage girl, no older than 17, wearing a crumpled fast food uniform. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her dark eyes darting nervously. "Just late for work," she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly. "Didn't mean to." Clint cut her off with a raised hand. "License and registration," he repeated. She fumbled in her bag, an old and tattered backpack. The zipper was broken, held together with safety pins, and patches covered the worn fabric. Papers and small trinkets spilled out as she searched, and then something caught the morning light. A silver ring. It tumbled onto the seat, and Clint froze. His heart raced as he recognized it. The intricate pattern of 3 intertwined hearts was unmistakable. It was Natalie's ring. The same ring that had been buried with her. "Where did you get that?" Clint asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl's eyes widened, and she instinctively covered the ring with her hand. "It's mine," she said defensively, her voice rising. "I didn't steal it." Clint struggled to process her words. How could it be hers? The logical part of his mind screamed for him to remain calm, to follow procedure. But the emotional weight of the moment was suffocating. "That ring," Clint said, his voice cracking, "was buried with my daughter." The girl's expression shifted from defensive to fearful. Her grip on the ring tightened as if it were a lifeline. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice wavered. "Step out of the car," Clint ordered. His professional demeanor was slipping, but he couldn't stop the flood of emotions surging within him. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting to the side mirror and then back to him. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice cracking. Clint took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "Step out of the car. Now." Reluctantly, she complied, her shoulders hunched and her movements slow. Clint glanced back at the ring, still lying on the seat, gleaming in the soft morning light. His mind raced with questions. Who was this girl? And how did she have Natalie's ring? As he placed handcuffs around her wrists, he felt a pang of guilt. But there was no turning back now. He needed answers, and he needed them soon. "Tell me your name," he said, his voice softer now. "Claire," she replied, her tone subdued. "Claire Robinson." Clint nodded, guiding her toward his patrol car. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the highway. The once peaceful road was now a place of confusion and pain, a stark reminder that the past was never truly gone. As Clint drove toward the station, the ring lay in his evidence bag on the passenger seat. He glanced at it briefly, the memories of Natalie flooding back. He didn't know how, but he was certain of one thing. This ring was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a clue, a thread connecting the present to a past he thought he had buried. The secrets beneath the surface. The soft hum of the patrol car filled the silence as Clint Walker glanced at Claire Robinson in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were locked on the passing scenery, her face unreadable but taut with tension. He could see her fingers fiddling with the hem of her uniform, pulling loose threads until they frayed entirely. The evidence bag containing the ring rested on the passenger seat. It seemed almost to taunt Clint, shimmering in the early morning sunlight streaming through the windshield. His thoughts churned. How could Claire, this girl he'd never met, possess something so personal, so sacred? A ring he had buried with Natalie in a moment of unspeakable grief. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as memories of that day surfaced. The heavy air in the cemetery, the clinking sound of dirt hitting the coffin, and the finality of watching Natalie's casket lowered into the ground. That ring had been his last gift to her, a token of love meant to remain with her forever. Yet here it was, in the hands of a stranger. Claire shifted uncomfortably in the back seat, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice quieter than before, stripped of the defiance she'd shown earlier. "To the station," Clint replied, his tone gruff but steady. "We need to sort this out." "You don't understand," Claire murmured, her voice barely audible. She leaned her forehead against the window. "I didn't steal it." Clint exhaled sharply. "Then explain." "Because that ring was buried with my daughter." Claire turned her head toward him, her dark eyes wide with a mix of fear and frustration. "It's mine," she said firmly, but there was a tremor in her voice. "Someone gave it to me." "Who?" Clint pressed, glancing at her through the mirror. "And don't give me another vague answer." She hesitated, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but then she clamped her mouth shut and shook her head. "You wouldn't believe me." "Try me," Clint said, his voice softening despite himself. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of saying something, but then she retreated into silence, staring out the window once more. Clint felt a pang of frustration. There was something she wasn't telling him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was important, maybe even crucial. At the station, Clint led Claire to a small interrogation room. The space was stark and clinical, with pale gray walls and a metal table bolted to the floor. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Claire's face as she sat down. Her fingers tapped nervously against the table, creating a soft rhythm in the oppressive silence. Clint placed the evidence bag on the table and sat across from her. He studied her for a moment, noting the subtle signs of exhaustion etched into her features. The dark circles under her eyes, the faint hollows in her cheeks, and the way her shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. "Let's start again," Clint said, his voice steady but laced with determination. "Who gave you the ring?" Claire stared at the bag, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to reach for it. "It was a gift," she said finally. "From who?" She hesitated again, her eyes darting to the door as if contemplating an escape. "A woman named Marcia," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Clint frowned. The name rang faintly familiar, but he couldn't place it. "When did this happen?" "About a year ago," Claire said, her gaze dropping to her lap. She helped me when I had nowhere else to go." "Where did you meet her?" Clint asked, leaning forward slightly. Claire's fingers twisted the hem of her uniform again, pulling at the loose threads. "At the church," she said reluctantly. "Grace Methodist. They run an outreach program." Clint scribbled the name in his notebook, his mind racing. Grace Methodist. He'd driven past the church countless times, but he'd never given it much thought. Now it seemed like a lead worth pursuing. "Why did she give you the ring?" Clint pressed, his pen poised over the page. Claire's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Clint thought she wouldn't answer. But then she said it was a reminder that I wasn't alone. The simplicity of her words struck Clint harder than he expected. He leaned back in his chair, processing what she'd said. Was it possible that Marcia had come across the ring somehow and passed it on to Claire as an act of kindness? But how had Marcia gotten it in the first place? "Do you know where Marcia is now?" Clint asked, his voice quieter now. Claire shook her head. "I haven't seen her in months," she admitted. "She said she was sick. I think she went to a hospital." Clint made another note. "Which hospital?" "I don't know," Claire said, her voice tinged with frustration. "She didn't tell me. She just disappeared." Later that day, Clint sat at his desk, staring at the evidence bag containing the ring. He'd spent the afternoon combing through records, trying to find any information about Marcia. His search had yielded a handful of possibilities, but none of them seemed to fit. If Marcia had worked at Grace Methodist, there would be someone there who knew her. That would be his next stop. As he reached for his coffee mug, his fingers brushed against a framed photo of Natalie. Her smile beamed back at him, frozen in time. He picked up the photo and studied it, his heart aching with the familiar pang of loss. "What do I do, sweetheart?" he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "How did this ring find its way back to me?" The photo offered no answers, but Clint felt a flicker of determination reignite within him. He couldn't let this go, not until he understood the truth. There was more to this story than a stolen ring or a chance encounter on the highway, and he intended to uncover every last detail. As he stood to leave, the setting sun cast long shadows across his desk. The golden light illuminated the evidence bag, making the ring inside glint like a tiny beacon. Clint's jaw tightened. Tomorrow, he'd visit Grace Methodist and see what answers it held. Unveiling the pieces. The morning sunlight bathed the stained glass windows of Grace Methodist Church in hues of crimson and gold as Clint Walker stepped inside. The air smelled of wax and aged wood, with a faint trace of lavender that seemed to linger like a whispered promise. Rows of pews stretched before him, each one polished and gleaming under the muted glow of the light filtering through the windows. A small group of volunteers was gathered near the altar, sorting through boxes of donated clothing. Clint removed his hat and scanned the room. An older woman with a kind face and a clipboard approached him. Her gray curls framed a pair of sharp, inquisitive eyes. "Good morning, officer." "I'm Joan," she said, extending a hand. "Can I help you with something?" Clint nodded, his grip firm but warm. "Deputy Clint Walker," he said. "I'm looking for information about someone who might have volunteered here. Her name's Marcia." Joan's smile faltered, and she pressed her lips together in a thin line. "Marcia Andrews?" she asked hesitantly. Clint felt a flicker of recognition. "Yes, that's the one. I need to speak with her, if possible." Joan sighed, setting her clipboard down on a nearby pew. "Marcia was one of our most dedicated volunteers. She worked with the outreach program, sorting donations and helping families in need. But she left about 6 months ago. She's not well, you see." Clint's chest tightened. "Not well? How so?" Joan hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. "She has terminal cancer," she said quietly. "She's in hospice care now. Evergreen Hospice, over on Maple Street." Evergreen Hospice. The name hit Clint like a jolt of electricity. That was where Natalie had spent her final days, where he'd said his last goodbye. Memories surged forward, unbidden and relentless. The sterile hallways, the hushed voices of nurses, and the steady beep of monitors that marked the passage of time. "Thank you," Clint said, his voice thick. He turned to leave but paused at the door. "One more thing. Did she mention a ring? A silver ring with intertwined hearts?" Joan's brows furrowed in thought. "Not to me, but Marcia was always sentimental about the things people gave her. She believed every item had a story, and she passed them on to those she thought needed them most." She offered a small, sad smile. If she gave it to someone, it wasn't without reason. Clint pulled into the parking lot of Evergreen Hospice later that afternoon. The building was nestled among towering oak trees, their branches casting dappled shadows over the manicured lawn. The sight of it brought a lump to his throat. He sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly, as he steeled himself. Inside, the familiar scent of antiseptic and lavender hit him immediately. A nurse at the front desk looked up as he approached. "Good afternoon," she said with a professional but kind smile. "How can I help you?" "I'm here to see Marcia Andrews," Clint said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning within him. The nurse's expression softened. "Room 214. She's awake, but she tires easily. Please be gentle with her." Clint nodded and made his way down the corridor. Each step echoed softly against the polished floors, a cadence that seemed to mark the passage of time. When he reached Marcia's door, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Then he took a deep breath and stepped inside. Marcia Andrews lay propped up against a mountain of white pillows, her frail frame nearly swallowed by the hospital bed. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, but her face lit up with recognition when she saw Clint. "Deputy Walker," she said, her voice weak but warm. "I remember you." Clint pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "I didn't think you'd remember me," he admitted. Marcia chuckled softly, though it sounded more like a wheeze. "How could I forget? You were here every day with Natalie, holding her hand, reading to her. You loved her so much, it was obvious to everyone." Clint swallowed hard, the memory of those days as vivid as if they'd happened yesterday. "Marcia, I need your help," he said, pulling the evidence bag from his pocket. He placed it on the small table beside her bed. "This ring. It belonged to Natalie. I buried her with it. And now, somehow, it's in the hands of a girl named Claire Robinson. She says you gave it to her." Marcia's eyes filled with tears as she reached out with trembling fingers to touch the bag. "Oh," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I wondered when this would come back." Clint leaned forward, his heart pounding. "How did you get it? And why did you give it away?" Marcia closed her eyes for a moment, as if summoning the strength to answer. "After Natalie passed," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "the hospice staff collected her belongings. They gave me the ring. I think they thought I was family, or maybe they didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't bring myself to give it back to you. You were so broken. I thought it would hurt you even more." Clint's chest tightened, and he fought to keep his emotions in check. "Years later, Claire showed up here," Marcia continued. "She was scared, lost, so much like Natalie in spirit. I saw her sitting in the garden one day, crying. She told me she felt invisible, like no one in the world cared whether she lived or died." Her voice wavered, and she paused to catch her breath. "I gave her the ring as a reminder. I told her it was a symbol of love and strength, that someone had worn it who was deeply loved. I thought it might give her hope." Clint sat back in his chair, stunned. The weight of her words pressed down on him like a physical force. The ring wasn't just a relic of Natalie's life anymore. It had become a lifeline for someone else, a symbol of connection and compassion. "Marcia," he said, his voice cracking, "you should have told me." "I know," she said, tears streaming down her face, "but I didn't know how. And now, it's too late to change the past." Clint reached out and took her hand, his own trembling. "Thank you for telling me," he said softly. "And thank you for being there for Claire when she needed someone." Marcia smiled faintly, her eyes closing as exhaustion overtook her. Clint sat with her for a while longer, his thoughts a tangled mess of grief, guilt, and gratitude. That evening, Clint parked outside the Thompson house. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the tidy yard. Claire's silhouette was visible through the front window, her head bowed as she sat at the dining table. Clint knocked on the door, and Harold Thompson answered, his expression wary but kind. "Deputy Walker," he said. "Come in." Claire looked up as Clint entered, her eyes widening in surprise. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone guarded. Clint pulled the evidence bag from his pocket and placed it on the table. "I spoke to Marcia," he said. "She told me everything." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "So you know I didn't steal it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Clint said. He sat down across from her, his expression earnest. "I'm sorry for how I treated you. I let my emotions get in the way. And that wasn't fair." Claire stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thanks," she said quietly. For the first time, Clint felt a glimmer of hope. The ring had brought them together, not just as strangers connected by a tragic coincidence, but as two people searching for redemption in their own ways. And maybe, just maybe, they could help each other find it. Threads of redemption. The first rays of morning light peeked through the Thompson household's lace curtains as Clint Walker pulled into the driveway. He had spent the night replaying his conversation with Marcia, her frail voice echoing in his mind. The ring, once a symbol of Natalie's life, had somehow transformed into a beacon of hope for Claire. Yet, the question that gnawed at Clint was simple. Could this girl, lost in a world of hardships, find a path to redemption with someone like him guiding her? The Thompson home was warm and inviting, with the scent of fresh coffee wafting through the air as Clint knocked on the door. Martha opened it with her ever-kind smile, though her eyes carried a trace of worry. "She's out back," Martha said softly, motioning toward the garden. "She's been quiet this morning." Clint nodded, stepping inside. The home was filled with signs of life. Children's drawings taped to the fridge, stacks of books on the coffee table, and a ginger cat curled up on the worn sofa. It was the kind of place that felt lived in and loved, a stark contrast to what Clint imagined Claire's life had been like before the Thompsons. Claire sat cross-legged on the edge of the garden, her back to the house. The vibrant spring flowers stood in stark contrast to her hunched figure. Her hands moved methodically, pulling weeds and tossing them into a small pile. Clint approached slowly, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. "Morning," he said, his voice gentle but firm. Claire glanced over her shoulder, her dark curls falling across her face. "Didn't think you'd come back," she said, her tone guarded. Clint crouched down beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "I promised Marcia I'd help you," he said simply. "And I keep my promises." Claire paused, her fingers tightening around a stray dandelion stem. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice laced with both curiosity and defiance. "I want to understand you," Clint replied. "I want to know what you're running from, and what you're trying to find." Her laugh was bitter, almost hollow. "You think I'm some kind of puzzle you can solve?" "No," Clint said evenly. "But I think you're someone who's been let down too many times. And maybe it's time someone didn't let you down." The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely audible. "My mom left when I was 5, she said, still staring at the garden. "My dad tried, but he wasn't cut out for it. He drank a lot, made bad decisions. One day, he didn't come home. After that, it was foster homes. Some good, mostly bad." Clint listened intently, his chest tightening as she recounted her past. The pain in her voice was raw, unfiltered, and far too familiar. "The Thompsons are the first people who've ever, I don't know, made me feel like I wasn't a burden," Claire continued, her voice cracking. "But even they don't know the whole story." "What's the whole story?" Clint asked gently. Claire hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "Before I found Marcia, I was on the streets," she admitted. "I slept in shelters, in alleys, wherever I could. I did things I'm not proud of, just to survive." Clint's heart ached at her words, but he didn't interrupt. He let her speak, knowing how important it was for her to be heard. "Then Marcia found me," Claire said, her voice softening. "She gave me a place to stay for a while, helped me get back on my feet. She gave me the ring and told me it belonged to someone who was loved. She said I deserved to be loved too." Tears welled in Clint's eyes, but he blinked them away. "She was right," he said firmly. "You do deserve it." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of Claire's story hanging in the air. Finally, Clint reached into his pocket and pulled out the evidence bag containing the ring. He held it out to her. "This belongs to you now," he said. Claire's eyes widened. "I can't take it," she said, shaking her head. "It's yours. It was your daughter's." "Natalie would have wanted it to mean something," Clint said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was the kind of person who believed in helping others, just like Marcia. If this ring gave you hope when you needed it most, then it's right where it's supposed to be." Claire stared at the ring for a long moment before finally reaching out and taking it. Her fingers closed around it tightly, as if it were a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The afternoon passed in a blur of quiet reflection. Clint stayed at the Thompsons' house, helping Harold fix a broken gate and chatting with Martha over coffee. Claire remained in the garden, but Clint could see a subtle change in her demeanor, a lightness that hadn't been there before. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Clint stood to leave. Claire appeared at the door, the ring now on a chain around her neck. "Are you really going to keep your promise?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Clint met her gaze, his expression steady. "I am," he said, "but you have to promise me something too." "What?" Claire asked warily. "Promise me you'll give yourself a chance," Clint said. "Don't give up on the people who care about you." Claire nodded slowly. "I'll try," she said. "That's all I'm asking," Clint replied. As Clint drove home that evening, the events of the day played over in his mind. He felt a strange sense of peace, as if he had taken a step toward healing a wound he hadn't even realized was still open. Natalie's memory would always be a part of him, but now it felt like her legacy was alive in a new way. The ring had come full circle, passing through hands that needed it most, and for the first time in years, Clint felt like he was moving forward, one small step at a time, unraveling the past. The next morning, Clint Walker sat at his kitchen table, staring at the evidence bag that once held the ring. The bag was empty now, its contents passed on to Claire the day before, but its presence still seemed to radiate a kind of gravity, pulling his thoughts back to the unanswered questions surrounding Marcia, Claire, and the mysterious intersection of their lives. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, forgotten in the swirl of his thoughts. Marcia's words from their conversation at the hospice echoed in his mind. I thought it might give her hope, but there was something more, an unspoken undercurrent in her voice that Clint couldn't ignore. Why had Marcia held onto the ring for so long? And why had she chosen Claire, of all people, to receive it? The questions gnawed at him as he grabbed his jacket and keys. He needed answers, and he knew where to start. The drive to Evergreen Hospice was quiet, the hum of the patrol car's engine the only sound as Clint navigated the winding roads. Memories of Natalie's final days resurfaced unbidden, the hushed whispers of nurses, the faint peeping of machines, and the way the sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on her face, even in her weakest moments. Clint parked in the lot and took a deep breath before heading inside. The receptionist recognized him immediately and gave a sympathetic smile. "Back to see Marcia?" she asked. "Yes," Clint replied. "And I'd like to speak with anyone who worked with her closely. There are some things I need to understand." The receptionist nodded. "I'll let her nurse know. Marcia's been asking about you since your last visit." Marcia was awake when Clint entered her room, her frail frame propped up against the pillows. Despite her obvious weakness, her eyes brightened when she saw him. "Clint," she said, her voice raspier than before. "You came back." "I had to," Clint replied, pulling a chair up to her bedside. "I need to know more. About the ring. About Claire." Marcia's smile faded, and she sighed deeply. "I was hoping you wouldn't ask," she admitted. "Not because I don't want to tell you, but because the answers might be harder than the questions." Clint leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "I can handle hard, Marcia, but I need the truth." Marcia nodded slowly, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "The truth is, I've seen so many lives pass through these walls," she began. Each one leaves a mark. Some are fleeting, like footprints in the sand. Others stay with you forever. She paused, her gaze distant, as if she were looking at something far beyond the room. Natalie was one of those. She had a light in her, even in her darkest moments. And when she passed, I couldn't let go of that light. I held onto that ring because it felt like a piece of her spirit. Clint felt his throat tighten, but he didn't interrupt. Years later, Claire came into my life. Marcia continued. She reminded me of Natalie, not in looks, but in the way she carried herself, the way she fought to survive despite everything life had thrown at her. I saw her sitting alone in the garden one day, clutching a backpack like it was her only anchor in the world. She looked so lost, Clint. Marcia's voice wavered, and she took a moment to compose herself. I gave her the ring because I wanted her to feel what Natalie made me feel. Hope. Belief in something bigger than herself. I thought maybe it would help her find her way. After leaving Marcia's room, Clint sat in the hospice's small courtyard, the sunlight filtering through the branches of a massive oak tree. He couldn't shake the feeling that Marcia had left something unsaid, a detail she either couldn't or wouldn't share. A nurse approached, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound against the stone path. "Deputy Walker?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes," Clint replied, looking up. "I overheard part of your conversation with Marcia," the nurse admitted, her tone apologetic. "There's something you should know. Marcia had a connection to Claire beyond what she told you." Clint's brow furrowed. What kind of connection? The nurse glanced around, as if ensuring they were alone. Claire's mother. Marcia knew her, years ago, before Claire was born. The revelation hit Clint like a tidal wave. "You're saying Marcia and Claire's mother knew each other?" The nurse nodded. "They were friends, briefly. Marcia didn't talk about it much. But I know there was some falling out. When Claire showed up here, Marcia recognized her immediately. She said she could see her mother's eyes in her." Clint's mind raced. Marcia had known Claire's mother. Could this be the missing piece of the puzzle? Determined to uncover the truth, Clint dug into the public records after leaving the hospice. He searched for any connection between Marcia Andrews and Claire's mother, but the trail was sparse. It wasn't until he came across a faded photograph in an old file, one taken at a church event years ago, that he found what he was looking for. The photo showed Marcia standing beside a young woman with dark curls and a radiant smile. The name scrawled on the back in faded ink read, "Marcia and Evelyn Robinson, 2003. Evelyn Robinson, Claire's mother." Clint returned to the Thompson house that evening, his mind buzzing with questions. Claire was sitting on the porch steps, her knees pulled to her chest, and the ring dangling from the chain around her neck. She looked up as Clint approached, her expression wary. "You're back," she said. "What now?" "I found something," Clint said, sitting down beside her. He held out the photograph. "Do you recognize this woman?" Claire took the photo and stared at it, her eyes widening. "That's my mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get this?" "Marcia gave it to me," Clint said. "She knew your mom, Claire. They were friends once." Claire's hands trembled as she clutched the photo. "She never told me that," she murmured. "She never told me anything about my mom." Clint placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I think Marcia was trying to protect you. But I also think she wanted you to know that you're not alone, that your mother's story, and hers, are part of yours." Tears streamed down Claire's face as she nodded. For the first time, Clint saw the walls she built around herself begin to crumble. And in their place, he saw a glimmer of something new, hope. Claire's hands shook as she clutched the photograph tighter, the edges bending slightly under the pressure of her grip. The image of her mother, young, vibrant, and full of life, was a stark contrast to the shadowy, fragmented memories Claire carried. Her mother had been a fleeting presence, leaving only faint impressions of lullabies and fleeting embraces before vanishing entirely from her life. "She looks so happy," Claire whispered, her voice tinged with a mixture of wonder and sadness. "I don't remember her like this." Clint nodded, his gaze steady on her. "People are complicated, Claire. Sometimes they hide the best parts of themselves from the world. Maybe Marcia saw those best parts in your mom. Maybe that's why she wanted to help you." Claire's lips quivered, and she blinked back tears. "Why didn't Marcia tell me? She knew I wanted answers about my mom. I asked her so many times, but she always changed the subject." "Maybe she thought it would hurt more than help," Clint said gently. "Or maybe she was waiting for the right moment. Either way, it's clear she cared about you, enough to see the good in you, even when you couldn't see it yourself." Claire traced the outline of her mother's face in the photo, her tears finally spilling over. "Do you think she wanted me?" she asked, her voice cracking. Clint's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her question. He paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. "I think everyone who has left a mark on your life, Marcia, the Thompsons, has seen something in you worth loving. And I think your mom, no matter what happened, would have felt the same." The quiet evening air wrapped around them, punctuated only by the occasional chirping of crickets. Claire wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater, her breaths coming unevenly as she worked to steady herself. Clint sat silently beside her, giving her the space to process the swirling emotions he knew were overwhelming her. Finally, Claire spoke again, her voice steadier but still tinged with emotion. "What do I do now?" she asked. "I feel like I've been living in pieces my whole life. Like I don't even know who I am." Clint thought for a moment before answering. "You start by giving yourself a chance to figure it out," he said. "You've been through a lot, Claire, more than most people your age. But you're still here, and that means you've got a future ahead of you. It's up to you what you do with it." Claire stared at the photo for a long moment, then looked at the ring hanging around her neck. Do you think I could make her proud?" she asked, her voice almost inaudible. "I don't think it's a question of if," Clint replied. "It's a question of when." The Thompsons joined them on the porch a few minutes later, their expressions a mix of concern and quiet support. Martha carried a tray with 2 steaming mugs of tea, placing one beside Claire and the other beside Clint. "Thought you two might need something warm," she said with a gentle smile. "Thank you," Claire murmured, her hands wrapping around the mug as if drawing strength from its heat. Martha sat down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We're here for you, sweetheart," she said softly. "Whatever you need." Claire nodded, her lips trembling again. I think I want to know more about her. About my mom." Martha exchanged a glance with Harold, who nodded in agreement. "We'll help you however we can," she said, "but you don't have to do it all at once. One step at a time." Later that night, as Clint drove home, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The ring had brought them all together in ways he couldn't have anticipated, connecting their lives in a tapestry of loss, love, and hope. For the first time since Natalie's death, he felt like her memory was more than just a source of pain. It was a guiding light. He parked his car in the driveway and stepped out, the cool night air filling his lungs. As he stood beneath the stars, he looked up, feeling a strange but welcome sense of connection to something larger than himself. Natalie's laughter echoed faintly in his mind, not as a painful reminder of what he'd lost, but as a comforting presence, reminding him of all the love they'd shared. Clint smiled softly to himself. The journey wasn't over, not for Claire, not for him. But for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, they'd start piecing their lives back together, one small step at a time. A new beginning. The dawn broke over Cedar Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and lavender as Clint Walker stepped out of his patrol car. His boots crunched against the gravel driveway of the Thompson home, where he'd promised to meet Claire. Today was the start of something new, not just for her, but for both of them. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew-kissed grass and blooming wildflowers. It was the kind of morning that Clint used to savor during fishing trips with Natalie. He'd wake her up at sunrise, and they'd sit together by the lake, casting their lines into the water and talking about everything and nothing. As he approached the front porch, he heard the faint murmur of voices inside. Martha opened the door with her ever-welcoming smile. "She's out back in the garden," Martha said, her tone soft but encouraging. "She's been up since sunrise. Nervous, I think." Clint nodded, stepping through the house and into the backyard. The garden was alive with color, a patchwork of marigolds, daisies, and morning glories swaying gently in the breeze. Claire was kneeling near the flower beds, her hands busy pulling weeds, but her movements were slow and deliberate, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. "Morning, Claire," Clint called out as he approached. She looked up, brushing a stray curl from her face. The ring on the chain around her neck glinted in the sunlight, a constant reminder of the connection that had brought them together. "Morning," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with apprehension. Clint crouched beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "Ready for today?" he asked. Claire shrugged, her fingers idly tugging at the hem of her sweater. "I guess. It just feels big. Like too much all at once." "It's okay to feel that way," Clint said. "Big changes usually do." Today was Claire's first step toward building a life she could be proud of. With Clint's help, she had enrolled in a GED program at the community center. It wasn't just about catching up on the education she'd missed. It was about proving to herself that she was capable of more than just surviving. As they drove to the center, the silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the low hum of the engine. Claire stared out the window, watching the scenery blur past. "I've been thinking," she said suddenly, breaking the quiet, "about what you said yesterday, about giving myself a chance." Clint glanced at her, his brow raised in curiosity. "Yeah." Claire nodded, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I think I've spent so much time waiting for someone else to fix things. Marcia, the Thompsons, even you. But maybe it's time I started trying to fix things for myself." Clint smiled faintly. "That's a good way to think about it. But don't forget, you don't have to do it alone. The people who care about you are here for a reason." The community center was bustling with activity when they arrived. Volunteers directed people to various rooms, and the sound of laughter and chatter filled the air. Claire hesitated at the entrance, her fingers gripping the strap of her worn backpack. "You'll be fine," Clint said, his voice reassuring. "This is just the first step." Claire nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. Clint watched as she approached the registration desk, her posture stiff but determined. He felt a surge of pride, knowing how much courage it took for her to walk through those doors. While Claire met with the program coordinator, Clint wandered the center's halls, observing the programs and activities. A room filled with easels caught his attention, the scent of paint and turpentine wafting out. Inside, a group of teenagers was working on a mural, their laughter echoing off the walls. The sight made Clint think of Natalie. She'd always loved to paint, her bedroom walls covered in her creations. She used to say that painting was like putting her feelings on the outside where they made sense. "Deputy Walker." Claire's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see her standing in the hallway, holding a folder filled with materials. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Good," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I start classes next week." "That's great," Clint said, clapping her lightly on the shoulder. "I'm proud of you." On the drive back, Claire was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence of uncertainty. It was thoughtful, contemplative. Clint let her have the space to process, knowing that this was her journey to take. When they arrived at the Thompson house, Claire paused before getting out of the car. "Thank you," she said, her voice earnest, "for everything. For believing in me when I couldn't." Clint met her gaze, his own expression soft. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Just promise me you'll keep believing in yourself." Claire nodded, her fingers brushing against the ring on her necklace. "I will." That evening, Clint sat on his porch, a cup of coffee in hand as he watched the sun dip below the horizon. The events of the past weeks played through his mind. The ring, Marcia's revelations, and the connection he'd formed with Claire. For the first time in years, Clint felt a sense of peace. Natalie's memory was no longer a source of pain, but a bridge connecting him to something larger than himself. Through Claire, he could honor his daughter's legacy, carrying her light forward in a way he hadn't thought possible. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Clint whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, sweetheart, for bringing her into my life." And in the stillness, he could almost hear Natalie's laughter, a soft echo of love that would always guide him forward. Claire lingered on the front porch of the Thompson house, watching Clint's car disappear down the driveway. The ring around her neck felt heavier today, not in a burdensome way, but as if it carried more meaning than it had just days before. She touched it lightly, her fingers brushing over the intertwined hearts, and for the first time, she felt the weight of its history as a source of strength, rather than a reminder of her struggles. The Thompsons stepped out to join her, Harold carrying a plate of freshly baked cookies, and Martha holding 2 mugs of steaming tea. "You did good today, sweetheart," Martha said, handing Claire a mug. "Really good." Claire managed a small smile, taking the sip of tea. The warmth spread through her chest, easing some of the tension she carried all day. "It feels different," she admitted. "Like maybe I can actually do this." "You can," Harold said, sitting down beside her. "And we'll be here every step of the way." Claire nodded, grateful for their unwavering support. For so long, she had felt like an outsider in their lives, like a guest overstaying her welcome. But now, she realized they weren't just offering her a place to stay. They were offering her a family. Across town, Clint sat at his kitchen table, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. The photo of Natalie on the mantel caught his eye, her smile as radiant as ever. He got up, walked over to it, and picked it up. "I think we're doing okay, Nat," he murmured. "I think you'd like her. She's tough, like you were." Setting the photo back in its place, he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. There was one last thing he needed to do to close this chapter. Clint's truck rumbled down the dirt road leading to the cemetery, the headlights cutting through the dark as the stars began to blanket the sky. He parked and stepped out, his boots crunching softly against the gravel as he approached Natalie's grave. The headstone stood quietly among the rows, its surface etched with her name, and the words "forever in our hearts." Clint crouched down, brushing away a few stray leaves from the base. He sat there for a while, the silence around him broken only by the distant rustle of the wind through the trees. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately," he said, his voice low but steady. "More than usual." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, a photograph he had taken from the file earlier that day. It was the picture of Marcia and Evelyn, their friendship frozen in time. He set it down beside the headstone. "You were right, Nat," Clint continued, "about how important it is to help people when you can. I think you might have had something to do with all this. With Claire. With that ring finding its way back to me. You always believed in things like that. Connections, signs." A soft smile touched his lips. "She's got a long way to go, but I think she's gonna be okay. And I'm gonna do my part to make sure of it." The wind seemed to carry his words, swirling around him before settling into stillness. Clint stood, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. The following weeks marked the beginning of a new chapter for both Claire and Clint. Claire immersed herself in her studies at the community center, surprising herself with how quickly she picked things up. The Thompsons celebrated every milestone, no matter how small, and Clint checked in regularly, offering encouragement and advice. One day, as Clint dropped by the Thompsons' house, Claire met him at the door, a stack of papers clutched in her hands. "Guess what?" she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "What?" Clint asked, grinning at her enthusiasm. "I got accepted into a mentorship program for social work," Claire said. They help kids who've been through the foster system. Kids like me. Clint felt a surge of pride. That's incredible, Claire. I knew you could do it. Claire hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and hugged him tightly. Thank you, she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. For everything. Clint hugged her back, his chest tight with emotion. You did this, Claire, he said. I just helped you see what you were capable of. As the seasons changed and time moved forward, the connections forged through loss and redemption only grew stronger. The Thompsons became the family Claire had never dared to dream of, and Clint found a renewed sense of purpose through his bond with her. On a warm spring afternoon, as the garden bloomed in full color and laughter echoed from the porch, Claire sat beside Clint, the ring still around her neck. I think I'm finally starting to understand what Marcia meant, Claire said, her fingers brushing over the ring. About this being a reminder. It's not just about where I came from. It's about where I'm going. Clint nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. And where you're going, Claire, is exactly where you're meant to be. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the yard, and for the first time in years, Clint felt truly at peace. The past, with all its pain and loss, had given way to a future filled with hope, connection, and a sense of purpose. Natalie's light had found a way to shine on, not just through him, but through Claire, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, love and redemption could prevail. And as the day faded into a tranquil evening, the world felt just a little bit brighter.